video, we're going to start looking at our very first roots. So part of this course, a big part of this course, is learning morphs, the building blocks of words that English takes from the classical languages in order to create new vocabulary. We've started already looking at some affixes, we got some suffixes and prefixes a couple classes ago, and now we're going to start looking at our first roots. It's a small group compared to last time. We're going to learn 15 of them. But I chose these because a number of them are a good example of roots that we get from Latin and ancient Greek words, but that are a little bit like, sometimes more, sometimes less, like English words, or correspond to English words with similar meaning and the same background, right? They come from the same Proto-Indo-European word. So as I go along, I'm going to talk about the root, its meaning, and I'll mention the language it comes from. Again, you don't have to memorize that, but sometimes it's good to know for reference. And then I'll also mention the Proto-Indo-European word it comes from and the English cognates that come from it, which might help you to memorize it and certainly help you to understand the relationship that is between them. Okay, my notes dropped again. This is the only class whose videos I always have my notes dropped for. Alright, let's start with roots. Card and cord up first. I put them together because they're two different roots, but they mean the same thing. So card is our root for heart from the Greek language. We see card often as cardio in a lot of medical terminology pertaining to the heart. So think of the pericardium. Well, it depends on how much you know from medical terminology. I only know a lot because I have to learn these words. Or some sort of cardioplegia is a slight paralysis of the heart muscles, things like that. You'll see it a lot in those contexts. Cord also means heart, but this is our Latin form. And the Latin one doesn't usually get used in a medical context. This is actually true of all the sort of body part roots that we're going to learn. The Greek ones tend to be used for medical terminology, the Latin ones not so much. But we see this in words like cordial, right? Things like that. I know they both come from cared in Proto-Indo-European, and we saw that if we look at that chart of correspondences, it corresponds pretty well to the English word heart, right? Heart, cord, and card all come from this root. Next up is gen, G-E-N. This is a very productive root in the English language, and it comes from a very I don't want to say basic word, but it's a word that has a wide range of meaning. It covers a lot of ground. So it refers to birth or origin of something. And similarly to that, it can mean like producing something. Again, in medical and scientific terminology, you'll often see gen, jenny, and genic at the end of words, meaning like it produces something. It can also mean a race of people, or just like a sort or kind or type of something. Right, something that has a similar origin is the idea behind that. And this is a Greek root. And so we see this in words like genus. Genus is a kind of something. We see it in congenital. Congenital, like a congenital defect, is something you're born with. We see it like an antigen, right, producing antibodies. Or genocide, which is the murder of a race of people. So it has a range here, although they are all based around the basic idea that this comes from, because it comes from the Proto-Indo-European root gene, which means to give birth. So it's all about this idea of similar birth or origin. And in English, this is cognate with kin, like your kinfolk, your relatives, and kind, right? The kind of thing, the type of thing, right? This is the same root in different languages. Okay, next up, we will do mater and pater. So, mater, and then I do the little squiggle in matra. And this is an important thing to note here, because you're going to see it a lot. And that is that there are a number of roots that have more than one form. Usually they have a second form. And the reason for that we will get into when we look at the Greek and Latin languages that they come from in a little bit more detail. But the basic idea is that there's often more than one root for a noun or a verb in Latin or Greek, and so we have to account for both. So with mother, for instance, you sometimes see mater, you sometimes see matra. Now, this root is identical in Latin and Greek, so we can't make that distinction. It can be found from either. And so from it we get words like maternal and matriarchy. pater is very similar. You see pater or patra. Again, they're so similar in Latin and Greek that you can't always tell what language it comes from. They're identical. And here we get words like paternal and patriarchy. Now, I think we kind of talked about these already, but these come from the Proto-Indo-European mater, and this is from pater really. And so mother and father both come from these. All right, next up, feet, right? So ped. Ped is a root meaning foot, comes from Latin. Its Greek equivalent is pus, P-U-S, and then pod, again meaning foot, but this is the Greek word for foot. Think of words like a pedal on a bike, you put your foot there. Or for pus, octopus, an 8-footed, really legged, but 8-footed creature. For pod, we have a lot of animals described as like a gastropod or an arthropod, referring to their feet in some way, or like a podiatrist is a foot doctor. And so these all come from the Proto-Indo-European ped, and English foot is related to that because English tends to take P's and makes them into F's, and D's makes them into T's, so they're all related. Next up is phon, P-H-O-N, and it means a sound. This is a Greek one. Only Greek uses PH, you don't see that in Latin. And so we see this in things like phonics and stuff like that relating to sound and noise. This actually ultimately comes from a Proto-Indo-European root ba, which means to speak or to say, like to make a noise. And it has cognates. In Latin, there's a root fa, which means to speak, which gives us words like fame and even infant, who literally from Latin, it means something like the one who can't speak. They're not speaking. And then in English, it's a stretch, but the English word that's really cognate with these is ban, right? Which is really to speak against, to forbid something. But ban and fame and phonics, they're all cognates. They all come from the same Proto-Indo-European root. I've talked about cognate in terms of language. They all come from the same common ancestor language, but words can be cognate too, if the words all come from the same ancestor word. So with ba, that means that phonics, fame, and ban are all cognate words, right? Because they come from the common ancestor ba. Okay, so all the ones we had so far were nouns. Now we're going to move over to roots that we get from Latin and Greek verbs. And I've got a couple here for you. All right, call, C-O-L, and colt. It means to cultivate or dwell. So maybe two different sounding meanings, but they're related in the mind, at least of the Romans, because this is from a Latin verb, right? So to cultivate or dwell. We get our word cultivate from it. Also things like agriculture, which is to cultivate a field, and the sense of dwell is seen more in words like colony, right, which is a dwelling of people. This actually comes from Proto-Indo-European quell, which means, it can mean to dwell, but its more primary meaning is to revolve or to move around. How these two get connected is, it's a little weird. There is this sense of like dwelling and moving around the same spot maybe, but from it we also get the Greek root sikla, which is from the Greek for wheel, and English's own word wheel. So wheel, cycle, and even words like cultivate, they're all cognates. They'll come from the same root. Duck and duct. This comes from a Latin word which means to lead, conduct, for instance. And it comes from a Proto-Indo-European root, duke, D-E-U-K here. And English has some cognates, including tug and tow, which is like to lead along, if you're tugging something or towing it along. Next up is fair and lot. Now, these do come from the same Latin verb, although they look very different. We'll talk about that more later when we get to Latin. And they both mean to bear or carry. Right? And so this comes from a Proto-Indo-European root, bear, B-H-E-R. From it, we get the Greek word bear. Like, I can't bear this anymore. Also, words like burden, it's something you have to carry, right, that you bear. Greek also has a root fair, P-H-E-R, which does show up in some English words, but it's not super common, so I don't bother with it in this class, but like pheromone, for instance, comes from this. All right. Next up is graph. And its alternate form is gram. This comes from Greek, and this is to write, but it can also be to depict, right, or to draw. This shows up in a lot of words. You'll find graph and gram at the end of a lot of words for an instrument or the readout from that instrument. Right, so think of telegraph and telegram, or electroencephalograph and electroencephalogram. A lot of scientific tools, so you'll see that a lot in that context. But it shows up other places as well. Think of like bibliography or stenography as well. It comes from the Proto-Indo-European root gerb, which means to scratch. And this sort of makes sense when you think about the origin of writing, which is that you kind of originally were etching into clay or to stone or something. And so it's from scratch. And so English has cognates here. English carve, right? Gerb, carve, you can kind of see it. Gerb to graph is a little tougher, but the R actually moved forward in that case. Crab also comes from this. Crab is like a scratcher, I guess, in the English mind, or the Germanic mind. Next up is tend and tense. It comes from a Latin verb meaning to stretch. Think of tension or extend, just to stretch out. And this comes from a Proto-Indo-European root ten, which means to stretch as well. Thin comes from this, the English word thin, something that's thin has been stretched out. Next up, ve and vect. The ve one is less common, but you'll see vect more often. It means to drag or carry. And this comes, again, from a Latin word. We see this in words like vehicle or vehement. The vect in invection and convection and terms like that. And this actually comes from a Proto-Indo-European root, weg, which means to go, to move, or to transport with a vehicle. And from it we get words like way and wagon, right, in English. Right? So these are our cognate as well. And then our last one for this video, which is vid and viz. This comes from a Latin verb meaning to see. Video, vision, television, right? All of these will come from these Latin roots. These Latin roots come ultimately from a Proto-Indo-European root, wide, which is to see. And its English cognates include things like wise. Someone who's wise sees a lot. They understand a lot. There's also some Greek cognates, which again, we don't really do in this course just because they're not so widespread in English words. They're not kind of worth learning. But in Greek, you find id and id, which show up in words like idol, right? Like someone you admire, someone you look to. The id is in words like kaleidoscope, which literally means a instrument for viewing, right? That's the scope. Kal is beautiful or lovely, a lovely sight, right? Lovely seeing. Okay, so like I said, when you're memorizing these or when you're preparing these for the course, you need to know the root and its alternate forms, and you need to know the meaning. The language of origin is just there for your reference, and the Proto-Indo-European roots that I have been discussing, I'm not going to discuss that for everything we see in this course because it's not super relevant, but I wanted to give you an idea of how there are these cognates in English which maybe you can think of to help you remember and understand the relationships between them. All right, thanks for watching. Bye.